Hello, everybody. Good morning. I want to, first of all, thank Vivian. It's very exciting to be part of this incredible international series. And it's particularly exciting to me to join this incredible group of scientists who will be speaking today. I have two daughters, and when they were little, I used to read them stories. And one of my favorite stories was the story about Ferdinand the Bull. And those of you who don't know this story, Ferdinand was big and strong, and so everybody expected him to fight in the bull rings. But deep inside, he was sweet and gentle, and what he really liked was to lie in the grass and smell the flowers. And one reason why I love this story is because it teaches us the dangers of thinking about things in essentialist terms. Thinking about things that they are carved by nature, that they are as they are, and that they're going to stay like this forever. And emotions, too, have often been considered in essentialist terms. And this is reflected in work by Paul Ekman, for instance, who argues that emotions are consistently captured by fixed and universal patterns of facial expressions. It's expressed in our popular cultures. For instance, the movie Inside Out that depicts emotions in highly stereotypical terms, and it's even reflected in our language, in figures of speech. But is that what emotions really are like? What are emotions, and can we handle them? So I have the privilege to open today's speaker series, and so I thought that I would stick to the basics. And what I would do is share with you some of the lessons that I've learned, having studied emotions for a while, in the hope that they might be useful to you. Inspired by dear old Ferdinand, I will refer to anger as a prototypical emotion and one that we often wish we could control. So here's lesson number one, and it's probably the most important lesson, and that is that emotions are aha moments. We all have at least some experience with emotions. Think, for instance, back to the last time you were driving, anywhere really, but in big cities like Jerusalem or London or Rome. And think to that moment when the person right next to you was driving way too fast or way too slow, when they were cutting you off, or my personal favorite, when they were starting to drive in reverse on the highway because they've missed their exit. Those are the moments when we feel the blood rushing in our veins and we feel like we're about to explode. And yes, anger often feels like a raging bull that's running amok and wreaks havoc everywhere. And emotions typically feel like these primitive remnants of our evolutionary past that are triggered automatically and take over. But what I would like to argue is that they're not. Instead, emotions are instances in which our brains try to make sense of the world around us. So our brains are meaning-making machines. They are designed to predict the future and help us orient our actions accordingly. When our brains make sense of the things around us by using emotion concepts, that's when we experience emotions. So emotions are not these fixed, pre-packaged programs, but instead, emotions are instances of meaning-making. They are times when our brains try to predict the future using emotion concepts to help us achieve our goals. Emotions, in the way, are tools to help guide us in the right direction. What do I mean by meaning-making? If you look at this picture, you might be wondering what you're looking at if you don't already know it. But if I say duck, then all of a sudden, you understand what it is that you're looking at. Now, these are instances in which semantic concepts help us make sense of perceptual information. Of course, emotions are very, very complex situations. But we can, right, they're complex because they involve information coming from multiple directions. Information from our senses, information from our bodies, information from the environment, from the situation, and that's combined with our prior knowledge, our prior learning history, our knowledge of emotions. But when we use emotion concepts to make sense of all of this, this is when we experience emotions. And then when we have anger and experience it, all of a sudden it wraps everything together and gives meaning to the situation. This is what Lisa Feldman Barrett calls the theory of constructed emotion. And it's a really powerful theory, and one of the main take-home messages of this theory is that emotions are not natural entities. Instead, they are moments of insight. They're moments in which we can make sense of the world and guide us toward action. Lesson number 2 is that emotions guide, but they do not determine our actions. And yes, when we think about emotions as entities, we think about them as something that has been developed throughout evolution to help us cope with these challenges that we've encountered over time. So the anger that you feel when somebody cuts you off in the road may be very similar to the anger that your ancestors felt when their piece of mammoth meat was stolen, right? And in both cases, the idea is that anger there to make us fight. And inspired by this idea a while back, we wanted to see whether anger, in fact, leads to aggression. What we did in the lab is we had people play a game that had a very aggressive goal. Participants needed to kill virtual enemies. And before they played the game, we randomly assigned them to conditions so that some participants were led to feel angry by listening to anger music, and some participants were led to feel calm by listening to calm music, and some were made to feel excited by listening to exciting music. And we wanted to know who will kill the most enemies in the game. What we discovered is that the people who were most aggressive were the angry people. Now, wait a minute, doesn't that actually mean that anger is deterministic? Well, I would argue that the answer is no, because aha moments don't determine action. Instead, what they do is they give us insight. They give us information that we can then use in creative and dynamic ways, in ways that are consistent with the situation they're in ways that are consistent to our goals and to our specific expectations. If we expect anger to make us fight, then maybe, yes, anger will make us fight. But we can also expect anger to influence us in a variety of other ways, and then perhaps the impact of anger might be different. In the study that I just told you about, it turns out that most of our participants, in fact, expected anger to make them more aggressive, right? Wouldn't you? And then their predictions were confirmed. What we wanted to know is whether anger, in fact, leads to aggression by definition, or whether it operates in ways that are consistent with our expectations. So to test this, we repeated this study. Again, we asked participants to play a computer game and kill as many virtual enemies as they could. We randomly assigned participants before the game to emotion induction, so we made some people feel angry before they played the game, and we made some people feel calm before they played the game. But in this particular study, we added a component. Before we influence their emotions, we influence their expectations about emotions. So we gave some people information suggesting that anger might enhance their performance in the aggressive game. And we gave other people information suggesting that calmness might actually enhance their performance in the game. And the question is, who would perform better? Now, if anger is there, designed by our evolutionary past to make us more aggressive, it should really matter what our expectations are, right? Okay. What we found is that the people who killed the most enemies were angry people. But only to the extent that they expected anger to help them play better. And in fact, participants who were calm also were very effective in killing virtual enemies to the extent they expected calmness to help them play better in the game. And what that means is that emotions do in fact shape and influence our behavior, but not in deterministic ways, but rather in ways that are dynamic and creative and are consistent with what we would expect. Lesson number 3 is that we can manage our emotions. We know that we can manipulate and influence aha moments in general. For instance, we can change the way that we see the world by changing the concepts that we use. There you go. All of a sudden, the world has changed. Of course, emotions are very unique aha moments. They are typically intense, they are embodied, and they're often unruly. But I would argue that we can, in fact, grab the bull by its horns, so to speak. For instance, we can change our emotions by using different concepts, different emotion concepts. We can change our emotions. It is hard, and it takes practice and skill, but we can do it. I think the question is, how can we manage our emotions wisely? And here I have another lesson to share. And that is that we can manage our emotions to feel better, but we can also manage our emotions to do better. If emotions are moments of insight, we can use it in creative ways, depending on what's important to us. For instance, we can amplify our anger and ride it all the way to war, if this is what we want. We can tame our anger and decrease it, either to feel better or to gain control. We can use anger to energize us, to find non-aggressive solutions to our problems. And we can use anger to influence other people and maybe collectively work together to achieve our goals. In our research, we have often found that people strive to feel emotions not necessarily because they feel good, but rather because they can help them achieve whatever goals are important to them. So people who are in a negotiation situation, those who want to gain the upper hand are motivated to amplify their anger before the negotiation. Those who want to maintain long-term relationships do not. People whose political ideology emphasizes power hierarchies are motivated to feel anger toward members of the outgroup, whereas people whose political ideology emphasizes equality do not. And what's interesting is that when we look around the world, we know that people typically feel different emotions, and we know that they strive for different emotions around the world. But to the extent that individuals endorse values like dominance and achievement, they want to feel more pride, but they also want to feel more anger and contempt. And people who value things like universalism and benevolence want to feel more love, empathy, and compassion. So people use their emotions and strive for emotions that are consistent with what they value. But I have another lesson to share, and that is that people can manage their emotions, but only when it's called for. Sure, we've all experienced those situations where we wish we could be stoic, myself included, when we wish we could turn off our emotions, right? Hit the pause button, lower the volume. But if emotions are moments of insight, wouldn't we want to listen and learn from that insightful information sometimes? I would argue that the answer is yes. In a recent study done with Elise Calacarinos in Melbourne, we wanted to know how often in daily life do people actually try to regulate their emotions, especially when they're feeling emotional distress. To test this, we approached a group of Belgian students the week after they got their grades of the first semester exams. These are very difficult exams. 85% of our sample failed at least one, and many students failed more, so these students were pretty miserable. And we wanted to see how often these miserable students were trying to get rid of these negative emotions. Now, of course, people who didn't fail any exams rarely tried to decrease their negative emotions. But the question is, what happens with those people who failed many exams? How often did they regulate their emotions? Do I hear 100%? Maybe just 50% of the time? The answer is 15%. Yes, you heard me right. Only 15% of the time. Now you may say, what's the matter with these people? Were they too miserable? Were they not miserable enough? Maybe they were just really an odd bunch of folks. And I would say, no, they're entirely normal because emotion regulation is rare. It's rare because most of the time our emotions provide us with insightful information and we attend to it. It's only under certain circumstances where we actually need to manage our emotions. What are those certain circumstances? Let me offer a few pointers. First, there are times when our emotions provide us with inaccurate insight. When we feel anger, but actually we should be feeling another emotion, or when we feel very intense anger, when in fact we should only be feeling a little bit. When our emotions provide us insight that is inaccurate, that's when we want to manage our emotions. Sometimes the benefits that we could glean from our emotions are no longer relevant. It could be because the effects of emotions are potentially blocked, or because they're inappropriate or irrelevant. When our emotions can't help us anymore, that's when we may want to manage it. For instance, Iris Moss from Berkeley has done this beautiful study where she examined associations between emotion regulation and psychological well-being. She examined this in a group of women who experienced stressful life events. Some of these events were controllable. For instance, you could be in an abusive relationship and you can still pack up your bags and leave. Some of these situations were uncontrollable. For instance, you have experienced a natural disaster and you can no longer do anything about it. What she found is that emotion regulation was beneficial when people were experiencing uncontrollable events. But when people were experiencing events that they could still control, emotion regulation was no longer beneficial. And this is potentially because people were getting this important, insightful information from their emotions that they were no longer paying attention to. So when our emotions are potentially no longer useful, we may want to manage them. And finally, emotions influence us, obviously, but they also influence people around us. And to the extent that our emotions can hurt others, I argue that we may want to manage them then as well. Together with Eran Halperin, we have been studying emotion regulation in the context of intergroup conflicts. We found that there are people who get very angry in political context, but they're not motivated to change their anger at all. And those individuals let their anger rise and play out. They are then more likely to support aggressive policies and less likely to tolerate and listen to the other. When we convince people that maybe anger should be subdued in that context, they then express less intolerance and are more likely to listen and work with others to resolve the conflict. So I would argue that we want to manage our emotions also to influence, to benefit other people. So we should manage emotions sometimes, but not always. The last lesson that I have to share is one that took me a while to learn. I am an emotion researcher, mea culpa. And I share the stage today with some brilliant emotion researchers. And I'm speaking at a forum on emotions to an audience who is here hopefully to learn about emotions. So for us, emotion is at the center of the universe. But if we take a step back, we might actually realize that emotions are just one tool or one signal in the richness that is our mental universe. And in other cultures, people may not give that much attention to emotion and also acknowledge other sources of input. In COVID-19, people around the world were experiencing a lot of emotional distress. We wanted to know whether people around the world were equally motivated to rid themselves of their negative emotions. What we found is that people in Western countries like the US or the UK or Germany really wanted not to feel any negative emotions at all. They were more attentive to their emotions and they invested more effort in getting rid of them. But people in East Asian countries like Japan or China or South Korea were less motivated to decrease their negative emotions and in fact attended to them less. And it's kind of interesting because when we think about collectivism, we think about it as synonymous with conformity, right? We think that people in Japan or in China all act the same. But the thing is, that research on social conformity has typically focused on norms for behavior, right? How we should behave. But what about norms for emotion, right? How we should be feeling. So together with Alon Vishkin, who's a former doctoral student of mine, we recently discovered that when it comes to emotion norms, the things are actually reversed. So people in individualistic cultures are more similar to each other emotionally. They strive to more similar emotions. And when their own emotions are different from the prototypical or average emotion in their culture, they actually feel worse. So emotion conformity is actually higher in individualistic than in collectivistic cultures. Why might that be? Well, I can only speculate at this point, but it could be that in individualistic cultures, what really matters is what goes on within the individual. And so signals that are internal and subjective really matter. In collectivistic cultures, what matters is what goes on between individuals. And so perhaps in those cultures, signals that are external and objective may matter a little bit more. So emotions are important, but just how important they are may differ across cultures. So just to briefly summarize, emotions are aha moments. They're moments in which we gain insight and try to understand what's going on around us using emotion concepts to guide our behavior. Emotions, in fact, guide our behavior, but they do not determine it. We can manage our emotions to feel better, to do better, or to be better, but we don't always have to. In fact, maybe sometimes we can just lie in the grass and smell the flowers and enjoy emotions as one toolbox among many. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya. I just wanted to make sure that I understand the notion of aha moment. Are you speaking about that I'm conscious to the emotion? Because when I think about aha, I'm aware of the fact that I feel, but most of the time I do not. I cannot report to myself that I'm angry now. In retrospective, or if somebody else, tell me that you are angry, but most of the time it's for me not aha. I'm functioning, I'm acting, but I'm not aware. So what do you mean by aha moment?
Yes. I do think that emotions are conscious experiences. And the reason I think that is because they involve many unconscious components. But in order to feel emotion, we have to label it, and therefore it involves subjective conscious experiences. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Yes, please. Yeah, please.
When I was younger, I studied martial arts. And the first thing you learn... Okay, sorry. When I was younger, I studied some martial arts. And one of the first things you learn through martial arts is not to be angry when you fight. And you fight much better. You have to be controlled. So how does it follow?
There was a time when I would give talks about the potential utility of anger, and I would open this talk with a quote of a martial arts Olympian athlete who would always get angry before getting into fights, because for that person, anger was motivating. In other contexts, anger may not necessarily be motivating. I think that the key of what the message that I'm trying to convey is anger neither one or the other. Anger is whatever you make it to be as a function of how you perceive it, what's right for you, and what's appropriate in the situation. Now, of course, oftentimes it feels like it's taking over, but for different people, it does very, very different things. So whether it's good or bad to feel angry when you fight kind of depends on who's asking and who's answering.
Yes, please, there.
Thank you for the lecture. How will you refer to the theory of the three components of emotions, the physical, intellectual, and the thought, with regard to what you just said about that emotions are actually, we are aware of it. So what is the reference to this theory?
What is the reference to the theory that emotions are comprised of three components? Well, okay, let me go back and say, there are many different theories of emotions out there. There are theories out there that are inconsistent with psychological constructionist approaches to emotion, which I shared with you today. According to psychological construction, there is affect. The body plays a huge role in emotion, as do a variety of other components that are typically included or referred to parts of emotions. The only difference is that, according to the psychological construction approach, all these things are merely components, and what sticks them together is that conscious moment of labeling, when we use a concept to make sense of all these things that are sometimes happening together and sometimes aren't. Sometimes they're related and sometimes they're not. It's incredibly empowering because when you realize that how you feel is partly a function of how you make meaning and what you know, and we're all here to cultivate knowledge, I think it's a very empowering model. But it doesn't rule out the fact that emotions exist. It doesn't rule out the fact that emotions involve physiological components and they involve cognitive aspect. It just ties them together in different ways and explains them differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maya.